This is the second video for week two, or I'm sorry, second video for week 10. And the uh, topic under discussion here is friendship. So we're going to talk more about friendship and its integral importance to living well and living the good life. Now, one of the things that I think is helpful as we begin this discussion is to realize that the depth of friendship that Aristotle's discussing, the centrality of friendship, the integral role it plays in living a good life. The analog to that is actually marriage. And so, if we can talk about the connection and relationship between marriage and friendship, especially friendship of the good, as Aristotle discusses, we may get a better understanding of his ideas. Now, marriage, as we commonly understand it, develops sort of, often follows the following sort of pattern. Two people meet, they begin to take an interest in each other, they go on dates, they talk, they get to know each other. There's an awkwardness about it. There's a certain degree of expectation. There's a hopefulness that this person might be the one. There's a running the risk that he's not. He's a horrible person, and you never want to see him again, or she's a weirdo, and you never want to see her again. Um, so you run that risk. You go on the dates. Uh, you take a chance by asking the person out. The person could reject you. That's horrible. You don't know what to do afterwards, especially if you feel deeply for the person. Um, so you put yourself out there to begin to relate more deeply and more intimately toward the other person. Eventually, you get to know more about the person. You meet the person's family. You do a lot more things in common. You see the person in all sorts of different settings. It's not just at work. It's not just at a date. You see the person around her friends. You see the person around his family. You see the person when you're going and doing a recreational activity together. You see the person when you're running together, when you go to church together. You see the person with his fellow congregants or with his old schoolmates. You get a fuller picture of what the other person is like. And you're more and more drawn into the relationship with the person. The person becomes deeply attractive to you. You have a deep interest in wanting to be with the person. You want to share more with the person. And eventually it gets to the point that you don't want to just share things, but you want to share your very life with the person. So what started out as just asking out on a date now becomes the huge question, right? Is will this person spend the rest of your life with me? Will you be my husband? Will you be my wife? So at that point, then, if the person says yes, the people commit to living together for the rest of their lives. Now, it's important to pause here and talk a little bit about vows. Marriage vows are what make a relationship into a marriage. And it's a vow that two people make before some sort of minister or justice of the peace. It's a vow that has it's an action that has legal consequences. It's an action that's made with witnesses, so it's made publicly. It's not just made privately. It's a big deal. All right, it's a big deal. It's legal, public, etc. And these vows are like, one way I used to describe them to students when I was talking about this as to undergrad students was like, it's super promises or promises on steroids. You're not just saying, okay, I promise that I'll show up to work tomorrow. You're saying, I promise with all of my being, with every fiber of my being, from the bottom of my heart, to love and honor and support this person in sickness, health, and good times and bad times, and whatever life throws at us. in whatever situations we find ourselves, I promise to abide by this person, to care for this person, to be there for this person, and the other person promises and vows the same back to me. So it's a vow, it's a promise not only made that the person makes to himself, but he makes to another person, he makes before a community, he makes before a minister, and from a religious perspective, he makes before Almighty God. So it is to put it another way, the greatest and most essential existential commitment just about a person can ever make. Saying, I'm going to do this for you for the rest of my life, no matter what. Everything I have is yours. Everything that's yours is mine. We agree, we promise, we vow to share this, to be with each other, be there for each other, no matter what happens for the rest of our lives. So this again is kind of an, I don't know, say idealized presentation of the path toward marriage, but it's not the path obviously that always gets followed. People getting hitched in Las Vegas after meeting there. This is not what we're talking about. Or people who just get married because, well, we've been together for a while, you may as well get married. That's not what I'm talking about. This is perhaps more what you hope would happen in terms of a marriage. And it does definitely happen with people. And what it indicates, though, and what is relevant mostly for us here, is that it's a journey, again, from the surface to the depth. It's a journey from goodwill to genuine love. It's a journey from a surface level caring to a deep, total, heartfelt, existential commitment of caring. And one that has lifelong implications, one that has one that forms a lifelong bond. Now, why am I talking about marriage in this way as a tool for introducing a further discussion on friendship? Seems a little bit weird, right? Because with friendship, you don't have vows. You're not making, it's like I don't make a vow before Almighty God or before a minister or before a justice of the peace that I'm going to be friends with so and so for the rest of my life. I don't have to go through a divorce. It's not a legal issue if I break off a friendship with somebody. We don't, friends don't have kids together and try to raise a family together, etc. So it seems a little bit odd what I'm doing here. Now, all of those criticisms are true. That's absolutely the case. However, I think there's a way in which there's a very strong similarity here. Now, first of all, when you're getting to know somebody, especially in today's world, and you're kind of moving toward this deeper level of friendship, it does involve taking a risk and going beyond the surface. So this is something we talked about in class last week. I talked about it last video, but there is a strong analogy between asking somebody out on a date and asking out somebody you want to be friends with to do something together. It can seem a little strange. You feel a little awkward about doing it. There's an indication that the relationship has moved or is moving toward a different level. So that's one of the things that you feel awkward about or makes it a little bit tense in terms of dating, because you're like, oh, this means something more now. All right. This person isn't just here to study for a while. This person actually wants to like date me or this, whatever. Or this person isn't here just to stop by the water cooler at work. This person, wants to actually get to know me more. And it opens us up to new levels. It brings it into clearer focus that this is a more meaningful relationship potentially at hand here. And maybe we've been hurt in the past. We don't want to go there. Maybe we've gone over a bad relationship. We don't want to go there. Maybe it's just a feeling of I'm not ready for that or whatever it is. So there's senses that you have to time it right. You have to read the other person. You might be risking putting yourself out there and asking the person out. And I think something similar can happen when you're starting friendships with other people because you might misread the other person's signs. The other person just wants a surface level friendship and you want to try to bring it deeper. And that creates the confusion I talked about in the last video lecture. Or the other person may not be quote unquote in the mood for more friends and he just wants to stay on the surface and you can't go there. Or the other person's a little hesitant because he doesn't really have a lot of deep friends and he's not sure how to do this and he's not always willing to kind of expose himself to that level of vulnerability and journey toward that sense of intimacy. He likes to have his world more self-contained and secure because when you're friends with somebody, especially at the levels we're talking about, your life is not secure, it becomes porous. You expose yourself to getting hurt. You present parts of yourself that are messy, that are difficult. You manifest, your life becomes to your friend more of an open book, if you will. And sometimes we want that book to be closed. There's a lot of chapters in it and pages in it that show a lot of distressing and messy and dark things about us, or things we think are distressing or dark about us, and we don't want that exposed. But friendship has a way of bringing that out, and sometimes people don't want it brought out. They like it secure. They can keep that on the shelf. It's well ordered. Friendship gets messy. It gets tough. So there's lots of reasons why it's difficult to ask out somebody on a date, like we were just saying. And there are very similar reasons why it's very difficult to ask somebody to move toward a deeper level of friendship. I mean, just look at it this way. When you ask somebody out on a date, you're often saying, hey, you want to get dinner together. When you ask somebody to go to a deeper level of friendship, one of the ways of doing it is say, we want to do something together. Do you want to go watch a movie together? Do you want to get a drink together? Um, I think of the relationships I formed in grad school where I was really fortunate because one of the best relationships I formed there actually happened because my friend Ryan and I would just start going and getting dinner together at this kind of grungy pub in Silver Spring. And that's where I really got to know him more. And that was the basis of a really deep and beautiful friendship. And so it's this process of kind of moving beyond the more surface level engagement and actually exposing yourself to getting to know the person on a more intimate level. And that's why it's very analogous to asking somebody out on a date. You run the risk of being rejected. You run the risk of looking awkward. You run the risk of kind of looking like an idiot, but it's worth it because that's what allows you to move toward that deeper level of friendship with another human being. Otherwise, we're still kind of skating along on the surface. So I think that's the first real point of similarity, that a hermeneutic, if you will, or a helpful way of understanding the journey toward deep friendship is to see it as similar to asking somebody out on a date. Now, the journey though toward friendship is also similar as you begin to the process of continuing to date somebody, because if you really want to date somebody, you want to get to know the person. You're willing to listen. You're willing to try new things that you might not want to have tried. You know, you're willing to go on, if you've never been skiing, you're willing to go skiing with the person. If you never played tennis, you're willing to play tennis. If you hate swimming, you're willing to go swimming with the person. If if somebody hates basketball, they're still willing to go to a basketball game just because they want to be with the other person. Now, maybe in dating, you go further than you would in friendship, but I think in friendship, you're still willing to test out new waters. Why? Because this is what the other person is interested in. That happened in college. I remember that with my friend Paul, where he was really interested in certain types of music and he loved drinking tea. And that led me to want to try that because I was good friends with him. And I thought, well, this is something that's kind of cool. He seems to get a lot out of this. Let me see. And I found myself enjoying it. And it was something we could kind of bond over further. And the cool thing about that was it just sort of developed, but a sense of like care for the person on on the surface level as it goes deeper leads you to want to try more about the other person's life, to put it in that way. Want to experience more of life the way that person is experiencing life. You want to see life from that person's perspective more. Of course, that's eminently true in dating, that you try to get a sense of what is it like for this person? What's it like for this person to do this? Why is it so important for this person? How can I come to understand that? And a similar thing happens in friendship is you want to look, what's it actually like for this person? Why is this so important for this person here? And you can allow yourself to journey in those ways. Now, we talked about the analogy of asking somebody out on a date, doing the dating. Obviously, at a certain point, when you're dating somebody, there comes a time at which you realize, okay, kind of to put it bluntly, you either shit or get off the pot. You're either going to see where this relationship goes or you're going to end it. Now, that bluntness, if you will, is not always the case with friendship, because you don't have to move toward, moving toward marriage when you have a deep friendship with another person. But there are ways in which you're seeing if how deep it can go, right? You're seeing if there's more and more about yourself that you can share with the other person, and vice versa. So this is why Aristotle's sense of kind of differentiating between levels of friendship is important, because it allows us just tools, not the absolute essence of reality, but tools to reflect on what kind of relationship we're living out here, how we're relating to the other person, and to see, is it actually going to that depth of intimacy and deep care and love and commitment toward the other person. And if it is, Aristotle's like, yeah, go for it. And if it's not, that's fine, but realize that and have a sense of clarity, not, have a sense that this is what it is, and it's not the deep committed relationship I thought it was going to be, and that's fine. But I think there's even another analogy that we can talk about too, and it's this. So when you vow marriage to another person, it's total commitment, it's lifelong, it's all inclusive, all encompassing, as I said earlier. Now, we don't make friendship vows, obviously, but there comes a point in friendships where you really do commit yourself to caring for this other person. And it has to become more intentional and more deliberate, especially in today's world. So, what do I mean by that? Well, I don't live proximate to any of my deepest friends, my best friends. I don't see them on a daily basis. Okay. I don't go to church with them. I don't go to work with them. I don't play sports with them. I don't, they're not my neighbors. So they're not around me in my everyday world. I don't have daily interactions with them. And I think that's probably true for a fair number of people today, that we live in a world where not a lot of us still live in the same hometown, or if we do, a lot of people have moved away. We don't live in the same college community. We don't live in the same grad school community. We don't work at the same jobs that we have worked at. We don't work at the same jobs for our entire lives. Not a lot. People don't always belong to the same neighborhoods, etc. We have a transitory way of life. It's a lifestyle of life that's kind of in flux often. So we can be dislocated. Now, there's lots of things that we can say about that, but the main point I'm trying to focus on is that because of this dislocation and disconnection that we can often have, at least physically, from other people, especially our friends, friendship just can't like happen spontaneously. Why? Because if we're not reaching out toward the other person, we're never going to be able to maintain the friendship. Now, for some, this sometimes I think is a point of confusion, and I don't quite understand why. But it's like Aristotle is pretty clear on this fact. Okay, there has to be, how do you develop a habit like friendship? You put the work in. You do the activity over and over and over again. And if you stop doing the activity, eventually you kind of lose the habit. Okay. Now, you can still have some of it to some extent, but like you're not going to be as good at it, especially if you don't keep refining it. So, the state of friendship, if it's going to be maintained and it's going to become stronger, like any other habit, you have to keep working at it. And how do you do that? You be in contact with the other person. It's not like a magical thing that you can just say, well, I'm friends with this person and poof. There is no other work to be done. You can't say like, oh, I'm going to be virtuous and poof, it's going to be done. You know, remember Aristotle says happiness is a what? It's an activity of the soul. It's work being done. I'll give you another example of this. Aristotle has this idea of like the fulfillment of something. The word is entelikeia in Greek. Well, what does that mean? Well, one way to translate it is saying yourself being at work. So the fulfillment of something is not some static state. You're less like, oh, I've reached it and I'm not doing anything. It's like the fulfillment, for example, of a tree is the maple tree, just as one example, is the maple tree getting energy from the sun through photosynthesis. It's collecting water through its roots. It's collecting oxygen. It's providing energy for itself. It's growing. It's doing things. It's not just standing there like a rock. It's a living, moving, dynamic thing. It's fulfillment. It's being most itself in the best way possible. Is it working really, really well? And Aristotle says the same holds true for us, is that when we are acting virtuously and being virtuous in our lives, when we are exercising compassion and courage and temperance, etc., that's when we are fulfilled. So there's a dynamic quality to this. We are doing the work of human life. Like we talked about function, right? Function is this key term, and we talked about a lot, especially in week one. Well, function is the task or work of something. So us being rational and doing rational work is us fulfilling our human function. All of these things indicate that human beings and human friendship, more specifically, requires work. It requires effort. It requires time. Um, so the establishment of a deep friendship is insufficient for its continuation. You have to keep working at it. And this is why it's analogous to marriage. Because in marriage, you commit yourself to keep caring for the person. You commit yourself to keep loving the other person. You commit yourself to helping the other person. Now, in friendship, you don't do it with vows, you don't do it publicly, but there is a way in which you are committing yourself to the relationship and to caring for the other person. When you are married, you're living with the person, so that's where you carry it out. In friendship, we are often doing it, like I said earlier, through the effort of calling the person, writing to the person. You know, sometimes it's just something simple like a few text messages, but just keeping in contact with the other person and listening to the other person and going to visit the other person, etc. You do those things as a way of fulfilling the commitment you have to the other person. And it's tough in today's world because, like I said earlier, we are dislocated and often disconnected from each other, at least geographically speaking. But we do have tools that assist us. That is one nice thing about the cell phone for sure. And things like the Facebook or even an email, et cetera, that allows those modes of communication toward people who are physically disparate and spread out. It's a way that you can continue the work of the friendship, even though there is physical distance. So there's a commitment to working on to work to continue the relationship and to be committed to that. that's analogous to what happens with marriage. Now, another way that I think deep friendship of this sort is analogous to marriage is in the following regard. As we talked about earlier, in marriage, you make a commitment or a vow to be with the person through sickness and health, in good times and in bad times, no matter what. In friendship, you are implicitly saying the same thing. You're saying, look, I'm going to be there for you no matter what. And this is where you really know who your good friends are, when, as the expression says, shit hits the fan, because they're the people who are going to keep you centered, keep you sane. Just listen. Even if things get rough, even if things are difficult, even if it's like I said earlier, 3 o'clock in the morning, you're going to pick up the phone. You're going to hear the person out. Um, you're going to provide what comfort you can. You're going to provide what support you can. You've journeyed to that depth with the other person and you're willing to keep going. That's where you know you got a good friend. And that's where you've entered into the shared journey to virtue that Aristotle is talking about when he talks about a friendship of the good. The willingness and commitment to being with the person no matter what happens. And life throws a lot of curveballs. It's nobody's life is super easy, and nobody is perfectly content or anything like that. Nobody has it all figured out. Nobody has, as again the expression reads, nobody has their shit all together. In fact, if they did, they'd have constipation and be a serious problem. But anyway, um, because of those facts, being friends with somebody will always entail having to face uncertainty, having to face difficulty, having to face doubt, having to face the other person struggling through something. And these struggles can be all sorts of things. You might think to yourself, what is the problem here? Why is this person having such difficulty with this? Or we've talked about this 100 times, or how come this person is still doing this behavior? All of those can be legitimate and reasonable questions. And sometimes it's important to get really direct with the person. Why? Because that's what's best for the person. And sometimes it's important that you kind of say, no, I'm just going to listen because that's what's best. It's interesting here where I think prudence plays a valuable role. We've talked a lot about how prudence is this virtue relevant for all other virtues. It helps us to see what's the right thing to do in particular circumstances. Particular circumstances of life is where we exercise any virtue, says Aristotle, and prudence allows us to judge what we should do. It helps us commit to that and follow through with that. We have a sense of what's proper and we act accordingly. The same holds for the virtue of friendship. Friendship is best done when we have a wise prudential understanding of what is called for in various circumstances in regard to our relationship with our friend. What is best for him here now is the kind of question of prudence that we ask and we answer when we have a good sense of prudence in our friendship with somebody else. And it's also important to realize that there is no textbook for this, right? Just as with prudence, it says like there's no recipe, there's no formula you can follow. You kind of figure it out as you go. You get a sense of what's best. You use that as a guidepost, but you're flexible because you realize certain circumstances and situations call for different sorts of things. So, just as an example of that, of course, we could say that sometimes the temperate thing to do is to completely avoid alcohol. Like, for example, during Lent, that's a temperate way of fasting. But then when you're celebrating a wedding with your friends, it might be appropriate to raise a couple of glasses of toast there's a way in which the prudence guides you to see what's best in these circumstances. And this similar in a similar way in friendship, there's no recipe. You can't say, okay, you listen for 1 hour and 15 minutes to your friend. No, no. Again, we've gone well beyond just basic justice math here. Or, I call him up every 3 weeks. No, you call him up when it's appropriate. And how do you know it's appropriate? You don't know the answer to that question beforehand. You figure it out as you go. Now, there can be some basic rules that can guide you, like, okay, you should probably reach out at least once a year to your friend, but you don't have a prearranged set of answers to these questions. You don't have a prearranged system of ideas. So I think this is one of the reasons why friendship is difficult, because you don't have a perfect grasp of how it's going to proceed. You don't know what's going to develop. You don't know always what you should do. You don't know what you should say. You don't know what the other person is going to say to you. The depths of human life that we encounter in friendship are not always properly charted, shall we say. They're not always properly mapped out. We don't know what's going to happen. So this is why friendship, a lot like marriage, again, implies trust. You can trust that the other person is there for you in marriage. And that's trust is a basis for your continued ability to work with the other person, to live together, to bake that home together, to raise that family together. You trust the other person is going to be there for you. And that can allay your fear of what might happen, can give you comfort because of the uncertainties of the future. And I think a similar thing holds with friendship, that you trust the other person will stand by you. So you're willing to share with the other person and divulge a lot about yourself because you trust the other person will respond well and lovingly. And you're willing to do kind of various stuff with the person because you trust that he's looks out for your best interests. And you're willing to expend all this time and energy because you trust that the other person is doing the same for you and trying to build you up as well. So trust is uh, trust is very essential not only to marriage but also to friendship. Now, this kind of I think gives us a clearer sense of what friendship is all about. Um, it's interesting, as we've talked about its relationship to marriage, but I want to kind of continue that more from a biblical perspective. So one of the very first things that we see in the book of Genesis is Adam is in Genesis 2 is made before Eve, and God then makes what's in Hebrew it's called a helpmate for him, and out of his rib, and hence comes Eve. And what God also says is that it's not good for him to be alone. We need to find him someone similar to him. And when Adam sees Eve, he says, "Well, this is the last flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone." And they come together, and we have the first marriage, the first coming together, deep unity, deep intimacy of two human beings. Now, what follows from this is that if somebody if somebody is lacking in that sort of relationship, from a theological perspective, if you will, there is something wrong. Something fundamentally has gone wrong. Like the idea here is quite interesting, I think. So theologically, what we posit is that God is a triune God, and He's a God who's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We furthermore believe that, excuse me, this triune God is community of three persons who love each other eternally. One way to describe this is there are three subsistent relationships of eternal love. Another way to describe it is that the Father loves the Son eternally, the Son loves the Father eternally, and the Spirit is the love that joins the two of them together. So there's this community of love, this love that is always being given and received among three persons in one God. This is, of course, the ultimate mystery of Christianity, probably the ultimate mystery of everything. But in Genesis, to go back to Genesis, we read about man being made in the image and likeness of God. And it says very clearly in the book of Genesis, let us make man in our image, says God. So what does that mean? Well, to be made in the image of God means to be made oriented toward love, community, and relationship, just like triune God is a God of eternal community and eternal love. So to be made in the image of that God is to be made for that, from that same love and for that same type of love. So in Genesis 2, when Adam is alone, there's something wrong. There's a he's lacking something, and God recognizes that and provides him with Eve, who is his companion, and again they form the first marriage. But if what I have said earlier is correct, that friendship is a deep and meaningful analog to marriage, then it also follows that the Adam and Eve story, the creation narrative in the Genesis 1 and 2, not only tells us something about marriage, it also tells us something about friendship. It tells us something about the fact that having deep, intimate, and meaningful friendships with other people is an essential part of our being human, made in the image of the triune God. That to live in deep community and loving friendship with other people is a absolutely integral aspect of our nature as human beings. Now, one of the things I think that has happened to some extent lately in the church, in the Catholic Church, is that there's been a large emphasis on the theology of the body by John Paul II. And that's had a lot of good offshoots, a lot of good fruit has been born from that. I think one thing that has sometimes gotten lost in the shuffle, the overemphasis has been placed often on marriage. And so the Adam and Eve story is read primarily as saying, okay, this is telling us that human beings are oriented toward marriage. And I totally agree with that. I think that's a very good reading of the text. I also think it's not the complete story. I think what it's also telling us is that human beings are ultimately oriented toward deep, loving relationships with other people. And marriage is obviously a paradigm of that, but it's not the totality of that. And because of that fact, if people are not married, it doesn't mean they're like missing out on being fully human. It just means that they express their human nature, which is oriented toward love. They express that in different ways. But one of the most essential ways they express that is in friendship. So the positioning of marriage as like paradigmatic can be problematic. I'll just say that. And I think this is especially true for us in this class, you guys. So, you're all studying to be in the priesthood. You're not studying to get married. It's I'm obviously just stating what you know to be the case, but it's fairly common perhaps to think, oh, what am I missing out on? And if we take a certain reading of Genesis, we'll think, oh, I'm missing out on marriage, which is this fulfillment of the human nature that's oriented toward love. It's missing out on marriage, which is this perfect embodiment of the Trinity on earth. And I think that's a very errant way of thinking. I think it's very important not to idealize marriage. Now, earlier I had said that there's sort of a hopeful path people take on marriage, and I mean that. I genuinely think I've seen that happen with my friends. It's a really beautiful and wonderful thing. It's a good thing, but I'm trying to idealize it. It's important not to idealize the marital state in any of these ways, and to recognize instead that the love of friendship can be meaningful, profound, essential, significant to our lives in a way that's very analogous to what marriage offers people. So, in other words, it's important not to draw like a frame of reference according to which marriage is up here, and then like second best is friendship. That's bullshit. I'm going to cut right to the chase. Couple of reasons why I'm saying that's bullshit. First of all, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So if that's the ideal, well, we're all pretty much screwed. Second of all, is the fact that anybody who has kept his eyes open and actually has friendships with married people understands that you can have very deep, committed friendships with people who are still married. So it's not like they've been ascended to this other realm now that they're married and they're like going back to what we talked about with the first lecture, this idea that now they're in a different station in life and we have to have different type of relationship to them. That again is bullcrap. It's changed, of course, it's different, but it's still fundamentally the same sort of relationship that you can have with the other person. And I think it's important to recognize you're not like playing the third wheel here. I want to expand on that a bit because, you know, I think it's sometimes easy to think, well, the married couple is going to pity me because I'm not married and I'm alone. And that's an easy approach to take. And you feel like, well, I don't really have much to offer this relationship. They're the ones who are in this paradigmatic relationship. They're the ones who are in this wonderful expression of the triune nature of God. What do I have to offer? Well, you have to offer a lot. Just dig below the surface. If their people are married, they're going, it's hard work being married. If they have kids, it's even more hard work. If they have jobs, there's a lot of stuff with that. And if they're going to school, there's difficulties with that. There's so much going on in the lives of married people that we can offer help toward those of us who are not married. And this pertains a lot, I think, to anybody who's not married, but I'm specifically directing it towards you guys who are seminarians, that the friendship with people who are married is an opportunity. Okay, it's an opportunity to actually be there for people and be available for people and have that kind of growth and virtue with people. They're not, they haven't been raised to the next level. All right, we still it's a deeper community of love than just those who are married and those who are not married. That kind of stratification or differentiation is actually, I think, very, very unhelpful and wrong-headed to try to do. So to kind of clarify this perhaps a little bit more, I've been kind of going off some tangents, is to say, look, from a theological perspective, when you're talking about Genesis 1 and 2, yes, it says a fair amount about marriage, but more generally, it says a lot about what it means to be human and to form friendships. And the profundity and depth and significance and meaningfulness and love and care that we see as marriage can also be manifest in friendship relationships. And it can also be manifest in our friendship relationships towards people who are even married. They are the sorts of people toward whom we can exercise that kind of friendship. As a matter of fact, that's what most of my friendships are, or a lot of them are now. And to wrap that up again, it's to say there's not this stratification. There's not this profound differentiation. The final thing I think I want to talk about in this video is that friendship is an opportunity for us to be most fully ourselves and to recognize ourselves more clearly. And let me explain what I mean by that. So I think we touched on this topic earlier. We touched on the topic of it's easy for us to skate along the surface of life and to present ourselves in certain ways to those around us. So you're friendly with your coworkers. You joke around with them. You say things are going well. You take on a certain persona there. You're joking. Happy-go-lucky, whatever it is. And you have a similar persona probably with your neighbors. You talk about the weather. You talk about what's going on in the town, etc. And what can sometimes happen, maybe often does happen actually, is that more of what's deep within us and what's uncertain in our lives and parts of ourselves that we're not always really aware of and we're not always willing to bring to the light of day can get submerged and get lost below the surface, if you will. And we don't feel ourselves at ease with expressing that, with being comfortable with it. But I think friendship provides us that opportunity. And I'm going to give you an analogy that hopefully will illustrate this. Somebody described a situation like this as when it's like you provide a cocoon around the person. And you're basically implying to the other person, look, whatever you say stays right here. It's not going anywhere. Whatever you do is going to be right here. I'm not going to tell anybody about it. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to laugh at you. I'm not going to run away. This is a cocoon. There's safety here. And the cocoon, of course, is where the butterfly comes to be, the process of metamorphosis. And that flowering of that insect within the cocoon. And analogously, I think, parts of ourselves come to fruition and come to be expressed within the cocoon created by deep friendships of people who allow us to be comfortable with expressing these parts of ourselves. Parts that, aren't always easily acceptable on the surface level of life. Parts that aren't always relevant to that surface level of life. Parts that we don't always acknowledge about ourselves. The person kind of gives us that opportunity. It's not judging us. They're comfortable around us, and that comfort around us makes us feel more comfortable with ourselves. This goes back to what I talked about earlier. The way my friend looks at me and helps me and relates to me can deepen and make more secure my own relationship with myself. That there's a dynamic bond, there's an interconnection between there. The other person helps me become more allowing of toward myself, of expressing who I am, of being more comfortable with that. Part of this sometimes can happen, for example, when the other person hears something about ourselves that we've held inside for a long time. we think is a dirty, dark secret, and the other person hears it and responds kindly. They don't get totally upset. They don't freak out. And when that happens, we realize that this part of ourselves isn't that huge of a deal. We don't have to hold it within as much. We don't have to be as ashamed of it. We don't have to be afraid of it. I think another thing that can sometimes happen is that we have parts of ourselves that we haven't fully integrated into our lives. And our friends see that and say, and compliment us on those parts of ourselves and encourage those parts of ourselves. And that allows us to be more comfortable in integrating them into our lives. Or they offer words of advice about that. Another thing is, I don't think our friends expect us to play a role. And let me just say a little bit more about that. So, when I show up to work, for example, no one is saying, like, Matt, you have to make these jokes or you have to say these things. No, none of that. But there is sort of an implicit expectation that I'll do my job, that I'll be fairly friendly, that I'll tell people about what was going on. And I'm not going to have too many in-depth conversations about philosophy on a ski mountain. I mean, I sometimes do, but so those are kind of the implicit expectations about what I'm going to do at work. And I think there's also implicit expectations we often have in many social interactions. Like I said earlier, you're not going to have an existential breakdown in front of the mailman. Um, Now, a friend, though, I think can approach us in such a way that he or she does not have a lot of expectations about what we should or should not do. Eventually, I think the friend doesn't anticipate that we're going to act in a definite way or not act in a certain way. I think they don't try to project that onto us, in other words. Again, it's about creating the space, not a set of expectations saying you're going to do this. I mean, just to use a spatial metaphor here, at work, you're supposed to act in a certain way according to these expectations. But the friendship is saying, no, we don't even have to have, we don't even have to have a bigger box. We can get rid of the box. Just be yourself. That's the expectation, which is not really an expectation at all. It's an invitation, actually. It's an opportunity. The friend is providing you the opportunity to be yourself in a way that other people have never done so for you. And that's and oftentimes cannot do so for you. Now this is interesting because when you do that, you become cognizant of parts of yourself that you never recognized before. Because if you're involved only in situations where there's implicit expectations about you and you follow those expectations, and anything outside the bounds of those expectations is not going to be something that you recognize or you're really conversant with about yourself. So let me get more clear on that. If it's the case that I have a certain way of acting around around my coworkers, a certain way of acting around my teammates, a certain way of acting around my neighbors, a certain way of acting around my family, etc., then anything that doesn't fit into those certain ways of acting is not something I've really processed. It's not something I've really reflected on or even been aware of. But I think a friend is somebody, as you journey with a friend, he allows you the opportunity to do that. There's no expectation. And you kind of can get like, wow, I never knew that about myself. Things about yourself can start to come up, and good, bad, and ugly. Um, I think the fear is that it's all ugly, but it's not the case. It can be very interesting things like, oh, I never knew I was interested in that. I never knew I cared about that. I never knew I could do that. It's not just, oh, I never knew about, wow, that's crazy thing about myself. It's also, I never knew that I was good at this thing. So our development into the fullest expression of ourselves is not done in isolation. That's pretty obvious. But this goes back to what I talked about earlier, where I was discussing Aristotle's ideas on human nature. So I was saying earlier that for Aristotle, the growth into virtue, the full maturity and flourishing of human life is never done in isolation. We can see that more clearly now why that's the case. Why is it the case? Well, if I don't really ever become fully aware of myself and who I am and what I'm good at or what kind of issues are bubbling below the surface, if that doesn't become something I'm aware of, unless and until I have a deep friendship with somebody who creates that space, that bubble in which I can see those things more clearly, in which I can express those things more easily, if none of that happens, then I am not self aware and self integrated enough to really grow more deeply into virtue. If that other person doesn't provide that mirror for me that allows me to see myself more clearly, if that person doesn't create that space in which I can be more comfortable with myself, again, I don't really grow more deeply into virtue. I don't really grow more deeply into human fulfillment. So the friend is just we're seeing more and more the deep significance of friendship for living well. You know, we saw that it's analogous actually in a lot of ways to marriage, and that was to the process of beginning to ask somebody out on a date, to dating somebody, to seeing how far the relationship is going to go, to committing yourself to the person and to committing yourself to the person in good times and bad. We also saw that from a theological perspective, this made a lot of sense too, that this idea of being made in the image and likeness of God means is pertinent not only to marriage, but also to friendship. And that friendship can be expressed in deeply significant and meaningful and loving ways, even toward people who are married. In other words, there's not this stratification between marriage and these other forms of life. Finally, what we've seen is that the friendship provides the space and the opportunity for us to express and know ourselves more deeply, and in that way, really become more fulfilled and flourishing, become more so the people that we were meant to be. So that wraps up the second video for week 10.